The diary burned her fingertips the moment she touched it, but Elara Fenton didn't drop it because the vampire king standing over her would kill her if she did. "Read," Draven commanded, his voice cutting through the silence of the underground throne room like a blade through silk. His white hair fell past his shoulders, gleaming silver in the candlelight, and his pale skin seemed to glow with an otherworldly luminescence. His eyes, dark as blood wine, fixed on her with an intensity that made her heart stammer. "Every word, librarian. You will read until the curse breaks or dawn comes, whichever arrives first." Elara's hands trembled as she opened the ancient leather-bound journal. She was 23 years old, had worked at the Philadelphia Historical Society for 2 years, and had never believed in vampires until 3 hours ago when masked figures dragged her from her apartment and brought her to this impossible place beneath the city. A palace of marble and shadow where chandeliers dripped crystal tears and the air tasted of centuries. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Why me?" "Because you're human," Draven said, settling onto his throne with the languid grace of a predator. "Because the curse requires a mortal voice to speak the words, and because every other human I've brought here has died of fear before finishing the first entry." He leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "You will not die, Elara Fenton. I forbid it." The command in his voice made something in her chest tighten. She looked down at the diary, at the elegant script that seemed to writhe across the yellowed pages. The moment she began reading, her voice echoed through the chamber with an unnatural resonance, as though the words were being pulled from her throat by invisible hands. "The year was 1247, and I watched my brother die for the 3rd time." Elara gasped as the words left her mouth. She tried to stop, but her lips kept moving, the curse forcing her to continue. "They called it the Crimson Death, a plague that ravaged our kind with a cruelty even we immortals had never known. Mikhail had survived sword wounds, fire, even beheading by a clumsy knight who'd forgotten to separate body and head far enough. But this sickness ate him from within, turned his blood to poison, made him scream for a true death I couldn't give him. I held him as he dissolved into ash, the second brother I'd lost in as many centuries. The first was Alaric, who'd walked into sunlight after his beloved took her own life. Now, this." Tears sprang to Elara's eyes unbidden. She could feel the weight of Draven's grief as if it were her own, could sense the ancient ache in those words. She looked up at him and saw his jaw clenched, his hands gripping the arms of his throne with enough force to crack stone. "Don't stop," he said quietly. "The curse won't allow it anyway." She wiped her eyes and continued, her voice strengthening despite her fear. "I am Draven Vladisek, 500 years old at the writing of this entry, king of the northern courts by right of combat and cunning. I have outlived everyone I've ever loved, and I begin to suspect that survival is its own form of damnation." The next entries came, faster, pulled from her throat in Draven's own voice, or rather, what his voice must have sounded like speaking his native tongue centuries ago. She read about wars between vampire houses, political machinations that lasted decades, betrayals that cut deeper than any blade. She read about a sister named Svetlana who'd been murdered by a rival court, her ashes scattered across holy ground so she could never return. Elara wept openly as she read that entry, felt the rage and helplessness bleeding through every word. When she paused to catch her breath, she found Draven had moved closer, standing just a few feet away, his expression tormented. "I haven't read these entries in 300 years, he admitted. "A witch cursed this diary, bound my grief into its pages so that I can never forget, never find peace. The only way to break the curse is for someone mortal to read every word aloud, to bear witness to every loss." His eyes met hers, and she saw something vulnerable flicker there. 17 humans have tried. 17 have died, their hearts giving out from the weight of the sorrow. "Then why?" Elara started. "Because I'm tired," Draven said simply. "Tired of carrying this alone. Tired of being unable to feel anything but the echo of old pain. The curse has made me hollow, and I thought perhaps if I found someone brave enough, strong enough to survive the reading, I might finally be free." Elara looked at him, really looked at him. Beneath the regal bearing and predatory grace she saw exhaustion, an immortal so weary that death might actually be a mercy, except that death wouldn't take him. "I'll do it," she said, her voice steady now. "I'll read it all." Something shifted in Draven's expression, a crack in the careful mask he wore. "You may not survive, then I won't. But you saved my life once tonight when your guards wanted to just kill me rather than risk another failed attempt. You stopped them, that has to mean something." He tilted his head, studying her. "You're observant. I'm a researcher. Details matter." She looked down at the diary again. "Besides, these are your memories, your losses. Someone should bear witness to them, someone should care that you hurt." Draven's hand moved so fast she didn't see it. But suddenly his fingers were beneath her chin, tilting her face up to his. His touch was cold but gentle. "You're unlike any human I've encountered in a very long time, Elara Fenton." Her breath caught. This close, she could see that his eyes weren't actually black, they were the deep crimson of garnets, and they held centuries of accumulated sorrow. "How long will this take?" "The diary spans 800 years of entries. If the curse allows you to rest, perhaps 2 nights. If not," he released her chin, stepped back. "If not, you'll read until you finish or until you die." Elara settled into the chair one of the guards brought, positioned it so she could see Draven clearly, and began reading again. The entries blurred together into a cascade of loss and survival. She read about lovers who'd aged and died while Draven remained unchanged, about human children he'd protected and watched grow old. She read about wars, plagues, fires, floods. She read about the night he'd found his entire court slaughtered by vampire hunters, bodies staked and burning, and how he'd hunted every single hunter down over the next decade. That entry made her voice crack with rage that wasn't entirely his. The injustice of it, the brutal thoroughness of the massacre shook her. When she looked up, Draven had turned away, his shoulders rigid. "They killed everyone," she whispered off script. "Even the ones who'd never taken a human life. Even the children." "Vampire children are still predators," Draven said, but his voice lacked conviction. "That's what the hunters believed. They were children." Elara repeated, and she saw his hands clench into fists. Horrors passed. She didn't know how many. The underground throne room had no windows, no way to mark time's passage except by the steady accumulation of grief she carried with each entry. She read about Draven's maker, an ancient vampire named Constantine, who'd been destroyed by the Vatican's secret order. She read about famines that drove vampires to madness, about political coups and assassination attempts, about rare moments of beauty swiftly crushed by reality's cruelty. She read about Elena. The moment that name appeared on the page, Draven made a sound like he'd been struck. Elara's voice softened instinctively as she read about the human woman Draven had loved in the 1800s, a violinist whose music could make even vampires weep. Elena had known what Draven was and loved him anyway. They'd had 15 years together before cancer took her, slow and agonizing despite every remedy Draven could find. "I offered to turn her," Elara read, her voice breaking. "I begged her to let me make her immortal so we could have centuries instead of mere decades. But Elena refused. She said immortality would steal the urgency from her music, would make her forget why beauty mattered. She said she loved me enough to leave me, loved me enough to remain mortal and finite and real. I held her as she died, and I have never forgiven her for that choice, even as I've never stopped honoring it." Tears streamed down Elara's face unchecked. She looked at Draven and saw that he'd turned back toward her, his expression raw with old anguish. "She was right," he said quietly. "I understand that now. If she'd become vampire, she would have eventually grown to hate me for taking her mortality. But understanding doesn't make the loss easier to bear." Elara wanted to go to him, to offer comfort, but she was trapped in the chair by the curse's compulsion to keep reading. The entries continued through the centuries, each loss documented with painful precision. Friends, allies, rivals he'd respected, humans he'd cared for from a distance. The diary was a ledger of love and grief, and Elara felt each entry carving itself into her heart. She read through what must have been the entire night. Her voice grew hoarse, her eyes burned, but the curse wouldn't release her. Draven remained nearby, sometimes pacing, sometimes still as a statue. Once, when she read about a massacre in a village Draven had secretly protected for generations, he drove his fist into a marble column hard enough to crack it. "The hunters thought they were rooting out evil," Elara read, her voice barely above a whisper. "They didn't know I'd kept the werewolf packs away, had ensured the harvests stayed strong, had guided the village through plague and famine for 200 years. They only knew that a vampire had been sighted nearby, so they burned everything, every home, every field, every living thing. Then they left a message for me written in the ashes. This is what sheltering monsters earns. I wanted to destroy them all, but that would have proven them right. So I did nothing, and the guilt of that inaction has haunted me ever since." "Stop," Draven said suddenly. "Please stop." But Elara couldn't stop. The curse yanked the words from her throat, forcing her to continue to the next entry. Draven's hand shot out and covered the page, his palm obscuring the text. The curse fought him, made Elara's throat work uselessly, but without words to read she couldn't speak. "I'm sorry," Draven said, his voice ragged. "I thought I was ready to hear all of this again, to face it." But he stopped, closed his eyes. "You're suffering for my sake, and I can't abide that." Elara managed to shake her head, fighting the curse's hold enough to speak her own words. "No, you need this. You need someone to know, to understand what you've survived." She reached up with trembling fingers and gently moved his hand from the page. Let me finish. Their eyes met, and something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, or understanding. Draven slowly withdrew his hand, and Elara continued reading. The entries grew more recent, documenting the 20th century's horrors. She read about Draven's attempts to protect humans during both world wars, the impossible choices he'd faced, the vampires he'd executed for feeding during the chaos. She read about the gradual decline of vampire courts as the modern world encroached, about ancient laws struggling to adapt to technology and surveillance. She read about the witch who'd cursed the diary. Morgana Thornheart came to my court seeking asylum, Elara read. She'd been accused of dark magic by her coven, sentenced to death. I granted her sanctuary because the accusations seemed unjust, because I remembered what it was to be hunted for merely existing. She lived in my household for 3 years and I thought we'd become friends. Then I discovered she'd been using my protection to conduct the exact dark rituals her coven had accused her of, blood sacrifices, soul-binding necromancy that defiled the natural order. Elara's voice hardened with Draven's remembered anger. I exiled her. I didn't kill her, though by vampire law I had every right. I simply banished her from my territories and warned the other courts about her nature. She took her revenge by cursing this diary, binding every grief I'd ever recorded into a weapon designed to torment me eternally. The curse ensures I can never forget a single loss, never find peace in the passage of time. It keeps every wound fresh, every sorrow sharp. And because she was clever, she made the only way to break it something nearly impossible, a human willing to bear the full weight of 8 centuries of accumulated grief without dying. Draven had moved to stand by a tall mirror framed in silver, his reflection absent as he stared at the empty glass. I executed her 3 months after she cast the curse, he said flatly. Hunted her down and ended her existence myself. It didn't break the curse. Nothing has in 300 years until now, Elara said, and kept reading. The later entries were shorter but no less painful. She read about the modern vampire court's corruption, about young vampires who'd forgotten the old codes of honor, about Draven's increasing isolation as he watched his kind devolve into exactly the monsters humans feared. She read about his decision to remain apart, to rule from a distance, to protect what he could, while accepting that some things were beyond even a king's power to save. The final entries were the hardest. They documented the last decade, a period of such profound loneliness that Elara's heart ached with it. Draven had withdrawn almost completely, maintaining his court only out of duty. The entries spoke of endless nights spent alone, of a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion, of an immortal beginning to wonder if existence without purpose was worth continuing. Sometimes I think about walking into sunlight, Elara read, tears streaming down her face. Not out of despair exactly, but out of simple exhaustion. I've survived so much, lost so much, carried so much for so long. Perhaps it's time to rest. Perhaps I've earned that much. But something keeps me here: obligation, pride, or perhaps just habit. The habit of survival when everything I've loved has faded to dust. When Elara finally read the last word of the last entry, the diary snapped shut with a sound like breaking bones. She gasped as the curse released its hold on her, slumping forward in the chair. Her throat burned, her eyes were swollen from crying, and her hands shook uncontrollably. But she was alive. Draven was beside her in an instant, faster than her eyes could track. His cold hands cupped her face, tilting it up so he could study her with an expression of stunned disbelief. You survived, he breathed. You actually survived. Elara tried to speak, but her abused throat could only produce a croak. Draven immediately lifted her into his arms, cradling her against his chest as he carried her from the throne room. She should have been frightened. He was a vampire king who'd just admitted to centuries of violence and loss, but instead she felt safe. Protected, he brought her to a chamber decorated in deep burgundies and golds, laid her gently on a bed that felt like resting on clouds. A moment later he returned with a crystal glass filled with something that smelled of honey and herbs. Drink, he commanded, his voice soft but brooking no argument. It will help heal your throat. Elara drank, and the liquid soothed the raw burning immediately. She finished the entire glass and finally found her voice again. Is the curse broken? Draven sat on the edge of the bed, his expression unreadable. I don't know yet. The breaking should be immediate, but I still feel. He paused, pressing a hand to his chest. Hollow. That's not the curse, Elara said quietly. That's grief, real grief, not magical compulsion. The curse forced you to relive every loss with the same intensity as the moment it happened. Now that it's broken, you have to actually process those emotions. Let them settle into memory instead of staying fresh wounds. He looked at her sharply. How do you know that? Because I felt it too. Reading your diary didn't just make me speak the words. The curse made me feel what you felt, at least partially. That's why the other humans died. The emotional weight was too much. She sat up slowly, meeting his garnet eyes. You've survived impossible things, Draven. Not just the events themselves, but the grief of losing everyone you cared about. That's not weakness. That's the most painful kind of strength. Something in his expression cracked, and for the first time since she'd met him, Draven looked vulnerable. Not weak, he could never be weak, but open, raw. I don't know how to feel anything but that pain anymore, he admitted. The curse made it constant, and now that it's gone, there's just emptiness. Elara reached out and took his hand. His skin was cold, but his fingers immediately curled around hers with desperate gentleness. Then you have to relearn. You have to let yourself feel new things. Build new memories that aren't soaked in loss. I don't know if I can, Draven said. I don't know if I remember how. Then I'll help you, Elara said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. She didn't fully understand why she felt this pull toward him, this need to ease his suffering. Maybe it was because she'd lived through his memories, felt his grief as her own. Maybe it was because beneath the Vampire King's dangerous exterior, she'd glimpsed someone who'd tried so hard to be good despite the monster the world expected him to be. Or maybe it was simply because when Draven looked at her, she felt seen in a way she'd never experienced before. Draven's thumb traced circles on the back of her hand, the gesture almost unconscious. You should rest. Reading that diary would have killed a lesser human, and even you must be exhausted. Will you stay? The words escaped before Elara could stop them, and she felt her cheeks heat. I mean, I don't want to be alone right now. Everything I felt while reading, it's still so present. Understanding flickered across Draven's face. He shifted to sit against the headboard, then gently pulled Elara to rest against his chest. His arms came around her, holding her with careful strength. Sleep, he murmured. You're safe here, I swear it. Elara closed her eyes and let exhaustion take her, lulled by the absence of a heartbeat beneath her ear. She'd never realized silence could be so comforting. When she woke, the room was lit by soft candlelight, and Draven was exactly where she'd left him, his arms still holding her secure. His eyes were open, fixed on the ceiling, and she could see him processing, working through centuries of accumulated grief without the curse forcing it to stay fresh. How long did I sleep? She asked. 6 hours. The sun set an hour ago. Draven looked down at her, and something in his expression had shifted. The hollowness was still there, but alongside it was a spark of something else. Curiosity, perhaps, or possibility. How do you feel? Wrung out, Elara admitted. Like I've been crying for days, but alive. She sat up slowly, pushing her dark hair back from her face. You? Different, Draven said after a moment. The grief is still there, but it's quieter. Distant, like a memory should be instead of an open wound. His hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch reverent. You gave that to me. Somehow, you survived what 17 others couldn't, and you broke a curse that's tormented me for 300 years. Elara leaned into his touch. What happens now? You brought me here by force, but the curse is broken. Do I go back to my normal life and pretend none of this happened? Pain flashed across Draven's features. Is that what you want? She should say yes. She should want to return to her small apartment, her quiet job at the Historical Society, her safe and predictable existence. But the thought of never seeing Draven again, never knowing if he learned to feel something beyond grief, made her chest ache. No, she whispered. I don't think I can go back to pretending the supernatural doesn't exist. Not after everything I felt, everything I learned about you. She met his eyes. I want to stay, at least for a while. I want to make sure you're truly free of the curse's effects. You want to stay with the Vampire King who kidnapped you? Draven's voice held a note of dark humor. With a monster who's committed more violence than you can imagine. I read your diary, Elara reminded him. I know exactly what you've done. I also know why you did it. And I know that you've spent centuries trying to protect the innocent despite what you are. She placed her hand over his heart, felt the stillness beneath her palm. You're not the monster you think you are, Draven. He closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they were bright with unshed blood tears. You undo me, Elara Fenton. Completely and utterly undo me. Then he was kissing her, and Elara's world narrowed to the cold press of his lips against hers. The careful way his hands framed her face like she was something precious. The kiss was gentle despite his predatory nature, reverent despite his power. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, or at least Elara was breathing hard, Draven rested his forehead against hers. I don't know how to do this, he admitted. I haven't allowed myself to feel anything for someone in over a century. I don't know how to be with someone when I know I'll outlive them. Then we figure it out together, Elara said. One night at a time, one moment at a time. No expectations beyond the present. Draven laughed, the sound rusty but genuine. You make it sound simple. It is simple. Difficult, maybe, but simple. She kissed him again, softer this time. Teach me about your world. Let me help you remember how to feel something other than grief. Let me be part of your life for however long we have. And when you grow old, Draven asked, his voice strained. When time takes you from me as it's taken everyone else. Then you'll grieve, Elara said honestly. But you'll also have had something beautiful, something worth grieving. Isn't that better than the alternative? Better than spending eternity alone because you're too afraid of loss. Draven was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing idle patterns on her shoulders. The last woman I loved refused to become vampire because she feared what immortality would cost. Would you make the same choice? The question hung between them, heavy with implications. Elara considered carefully before answering. I don't know, she said finally. Right now, the idea terrifies me. Giving up my humanity, becoming a predator, living forever while everyone I've ever known dies, it's overwhelming. But I also don't know how I'll feel in 10 years or 20 or when I'm facing the end of my natural life. So I can't promise you I'd say yes, but I also can't promise I'd say no, an honest answer. Draven said, more than I deserve, perhaps. You deserve honesty, Elara said firmly. You deserve someone who doesn't lie about the hard things. So here's another truth, I barely know you, but I already care about you more than is probably wise. Reading your diary created a connection between us, something I don't fully understand. I want to explore that, see where it leads. But I'm also scared, because you're a vampire king and I'm just a human librarian, and this whole situation is insane. Draven's lips quirked into something almost like a genuine smile. You're not just anything, Elara. You're the woman who survived my curse, who bore witness to 8 centuries of grief, and didn't break. You're extraordinary. Heat flooded Elara's cheeks. I'm really not. I'm ordinary in every possible way. Then I've been waiting centuries for ordinary, Draven said, and kissed her again. The following nights fell into a strange but comfortable rhythm. Draven insisted Elara rest and recover from the ordeal of reading the diary, but he never left her side for long. He brought her meals prepared by his household staff, humans who served the vampire court voluntarily, she learned, in exchange for protection and generous compensation. He showed her the underground palace, a sprawling complex of chambers carved from bedrock beneath Philadelphia's oldest neighborhoods. We've been here since the city's founding, Draven explained as they walked through a gallery lined with portraits. The human founders knew about us, made arrangements for peaceful coexistence. We'd protect the city from supernatural threats, and they'd ensure we had safe haven from hunters. That alliance has held for centuries, though fewer and fewer humans know about it now. Elara studied the portraits, vampires rendered in oils and acrylics, their white skin and hair making them look like marble statues given life. How many vampires live here, in the Philadelphia court? 43 at present. Worldwide, there are perhaps 10,000 of us left. We're dying out, Draven said without emotion. Our kind doesn't reproduce easily and we're hunted aggressively. In another few centuries, we may be extinct. Is that why you seem so tired? Elara asked. Because you're watching your entire species fade? Draven was quiet for a moment, partially. Though I think I've been tired for far longer than that. The curse simply made it impossible to feel anything else. He glanced at her. You've changed that. These past few nights, I've felt things I'd forgotten were possible. Hope, curiosity, desire. The way he said that last word made Elara's pulse quicken. They'd kissed several times since that first night. But Draven had been carefully restrained, always pulling back before things intensified too much. She appreciated his caution. Everything was happening so fast, but part of her wanted to push past those boundaries. To feel more of the passion she sensed simmering beneath his controlled exterior. As if reading her thoughts, Draven stopped walking and turned to face her fully. I need to tell you something, he said, his voice serious. About what you mean to me, about what I want. Elara's heart hammered. Okay, I've lived for over 1,000 years, Draven began. I've had lovers, companions, even one great love. But what I feel for you is different. Maybe it's because you witnessed my worst moments, my deepest pain, and didn't flinch. Maybe it's because you chose to stay when you could have fled. Or maybe it's simply that after so long alone, you're the first person who's made me want to feel again. He took her hands in his. I want you, Elara, not just for a night or a season, but for as long as you'll have me. I want to court you properly, show you my world, give you every reason to choose to stay. Tears pricked Elara's eyes. I want that too, but I need you to understand I'm not ready to think about becoming vampire. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Can you accept that? I can, Draven said without hesitation. If I have you for a human lifetime, that's infinitely more than I have now. I won't pressure you, won't ask you to become something you're not ready to be. I'll simply love you for as long as you allow it. You love me, Elara whispered. Already? Draven's expression softened. I've read countless romances, Elara. Watched humans fall in love across centuries of observation. Love isn't always slow. Sometimes it's immediate and overwhelming, a recognition of something essential. I looked at you reading my diary, bearing my pain with such compassion, and I knew. You're mine if you'll have me. My heart, my home, my reason to keep surviving. Elara kissed him then, pouring every confused, overwhelming emotion into it. Draven responded with matching intensity, his careful control finally slipping enough to show her the passion beneath. His hands tangled in her hair, his mouth moved against hers with desperate need, and when they finally broke apart, his eyes had darkened to near black with want. "Come to my chambers," he said, his voice rough. "Let me show you how thoroughly I intend to worship you." Elara nodded, beyond words, and let him lead her through the winding corridors to a massive chamber decorated in deep blues and silvers. The bed was enormous, draped in silk, and when Draven laid her down on it, she felt like she was sinking into clouds. What followed was slow and reverent and absolutely overwhelming. Draven touched her like she was sacred, mapping every curve and hollow with his cold fingers and colder lips. He learned what made her gasp, what made her moan, what made her arch against him in helpless pleasure. And when they finally came together fully, Elara felt something click into place in her chest, a certainty that this impossible man was somehow hers and she was his. Afterward, as she lay curled against his chest, Draven stroked her hair with gentle fingers. "Thank you," he murmured. "For what?" "For giving me a reason to live beyond mere survival. For showing me that something beautiful can still exist in my life." He pressed a kiss to her forehead. "I will protect you with everything I am, Elara Fenton. No harm will come to you while I draw breath. This I swear." Elara believed him. The next weeks were a strange blend of magical and mundane. Elara learned to navigate vampire politics as Draven's acknowledged companion, attending court sessions where she was the only human present. The other vampires regarded her with curiosity and varying degrees of respect. She was the woman who'd broken Draven's curse, after all, a feat that had seemed impossible. She met Draven's inner circle. Casimir, his second in command, a pragmatic vampire who'd served Draven for 4 centuries. Serafina, the court's diplomat, elegant and shrewd. And Lucien, the youngest vampire present at only 80 years old, who treated Elara with careful courtesy. "You've changed him," Lucien said one evening when he found Elara alone in the palace library. "The king, I mean. He's been so distant for so long, but since you arrived there's life in him again. Purpose." "He changed himself," Elara said. "I just gave him a reason to want to, perhaps." Lucien tilted his head, studying her. "You know there are vampires who will see you as a weakness, something to exploit against him." "I know, Draven's warned me." She met the young vampire's garnet eyes steadily. "But I'm not leaving. Whatever comes, we'll face it together." What came was Morgana's nephew. Elara was reading in the library, her favorite space in the underground palace, when Draven burst through the doors, his expression thunderous. "We have a problem." She immediately stood, heart racing. "What is it?" "A witch named Christophe Vance has petitioned for entrance to my court. He claims to be Morgana Thornhart's nephew, says he's here to negotiate compensation for her death." Draven's hands were clenched into fists. "He's standing at the boundary wards right now, and by vampire law I must hear his petition." "This is a trap," Elara said immediately. "Undoubtedly. But I can't refuse without breaking the old laws, and if I break those laws I lose the moral authority to enforce them on my own court." Draven looked at her, conflict clear in his expression. "I want you hidden while he's here, protected where he can't reach you." "No," Elara said firmly. "I'm not hiding. If this Christophe is here because of what happened with his aunt and the curse, then I'm part of this. I'm the one who broke it. He needs to see that we're united." "Elara, I'm not arguing about this," she said, channeling her best librarian voice, the one she used on patrons who tried to return damaged books. "I'm either standing beside you during this meeting, or I'm following you into it anyway. Your choice." Draven's lips twitched despite the tension. "You're impossibly stubborn, you're impossibly overprotective." "Yes," Draven agreed, pulling her close. "I am. Because losing you would destroy me more thoroughly than any curse ever could." Elara softened, reaching up to cup his face. "Then we make sure he doesn't get the chance. Together." Christophe Vance was allowed into the throne room under heavy guard. He was tall and dark-haired, handsome in a sharp-edged way that immediately put Elara on alert. His eyes, a pale green, swept over the assembled court before landing on Draven with calculated interest. "King Draven," Christophe said, bowing just deep enough to be respectful without implying subservience. "Thank you for receiving me." "State your business," Draven said coldly from his throne. Elara stood just to his right, positioned so she could see both the king and the petitioner clearly. "I've come regarding my aunt, Morgana Thornhart. You executed her 300 years ago for crimes you alleged she committed while under your protection." Christophe's voice was smooth, reasonable. I don't dispute that you had legal grounds for her death. However, she was the last of our bloodline besides myself, and her loss has cost me dearly. I've come to negotiate appropriate compensation. Compensation? Draven's voice was dangerously soft. Your aunt cursed me with 3 centuries of torment. She defiled natural law with her dark magic and betrayed my hospitality. I owe you nothing. Perhaps not, Kristoff allowed. But I notice your curse has been broken recently. Very recently. His eyes shifted to Elara. By this human, I presume. The mortal who survived reading your diary when so many others died attempting it? Elara felt cold dread settle in her stomach. Draven's hand moved incrementally closer to the sword resting beside his throne. What of it? Simply that my aunt's curse was specifically designed to be unbreakable. The fact that it broke suggests either she made a critical error in the casting, or— Kristoff smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. Or someone interfered with the curse's structure. Someone skilled enough to subtly weaken it so that a human could survive the breaking. What are you implying? Casimir demanded from his position near the throne. I'm implying nothing. I'm stating a fact. Kristoff gestured casually. The curse was examined by 3 independent magical authorities after my aunt's death. All confirmed it was perfectly constructed, genuinely unbreakable by any conventional means. Yet here we are, with King Draven curse-free and this human woman alive. Someone changed the curse, which means someone powerful enough to alter another witch's magic has been operating in Philadelphia. Draven stood slowly, and the temperature in the throne room seemed to drop. Are you accusing me of harboring a witch powerful enough to break Morgana's curse? I'm accusing you of nothing. I'm simply pointing out that the only logical explanation for the curse breaking is outside interference, which under the Accords of 1547 constitutes a breach of magical law. Kristoff's expression remained pleasant, but his eyes were calculating. Of course, if you could prove the curse broke naturally, without intervention I'd have no grounds for complaint. But you can't prove that, can you? The trap snapped shut with perfect precision. Either Draven admitted to harboring a witch powerful enough to break Morgana's curse, which would create political chaos and potential war with the witch covens, or he couldn't explain how the curse broke, which would allow Kristoff to pursue a magical grievance that could tie up the court in supernatural bureaucracy for decades, unless they offered a third option. I can prove it, Elara said, stepping forward before Draven could stop her. I broke the curse through completely natural means following its exact parameters. I read every word of the diary aloud while surviving the emotional weight of the king's grief. There was no outside interference, no magical tampering. Just a human strong enough to endure what your aunt designed. Kristoff's attention focused on her fully, and Elara had to fight not to flinch from the predatory intelligence in his gaze. And you'd be willing to testify to that under magical oath, knowing that if you're lying, the oath would kill you? She's not testifying to anything, Draven said sharply. I won't risk her life to satisfy your fishing expedition. Then you admit you can't prove the curse broke naturally, Kristoff said smoothly. Which means my petition for compensation stands, and the Council of Covens will need to investigate potential magical tampering. He turned toward the door. I'll expect their representatives within the week. Wait, Elara said. His hand shot out to grip her wrist, but she shook her head. I'll take the oath. Elara, no, yes. She met Draven's eyes, saw the terror there, and spoke directly to him. I'm telling the truth. The curse broke naturally because I survived reading the diary. There's no risk in swearing to that under oath, and it ends this immediately. She turned back to Kristoff. I'll take your oath, right now in front of the entire court. When I survive it, you'll withdraw your petition and leave Philadelphia permanently. Kristoff's smile widened. Agreed, and when you die, King Draven will acknowledge that magical tampering occurred and pay appropriate compensation to my family line. Done, Draven said, his voice like ice. His hand remained tight around Elara's wrist, and she could feel him trembling with barely contained rage and fear. The oath was prepared quickly. Serafina drew a circle of salt and rowan on the throne room floor while Lucien fetched the necessary ritual components. Kristoff provided the oath's wording himself, a long and complicated formula that boiled down to one essential truth. Either the curse broke naturally by Elara reading the diary, or it broke through outside magical interference. Elara stepped into the circle, her heart hammering, but her resolve steady. Draven stood just outside the boundary, close enough to touch, his expression anguished. If this kills you, he started. It won't, Elara said firmly. I'm telling the truth. The curse broke because I survived your grief, not because someone tampered with the magic. Trust me. I trust you, Draven said. It's magic I don't trust. It's capricious and cruel, and I can't. His voice broke. I can't lose you. Not like this. Elara reached through the circle's boundary to touch his face. You won't, I promise. Kristoff began the incantation, his voice rising and falling in rhythms that made Elara's teeth ache. The circle flared with green light, and she felt something wrap around her chest like invisible chains. The pressure increased as Kristoff reached the oath's core, the moment where she'd have to speak the words that would either confirm the truth or trigger the killing curse woven into the spell. Repeat after me, Kristoff said, his eyes glittering. I swear on my mortal life that the curse binding Draven Vladsek's diary broke through my actions alone, with no magical intervention or tampering by any other party. Elara took a deep breath and spoke clearly. I swear on my mortal life that the curse binding Draven Vladsek's diary broke through my actions alone, with no magical intervention or tampering by any other party. The chains around her chest tightened viciously. Elara gasped as pain seared through her, white hot and overwhelming. She heard Draven shout her name, heard him trying to break through the circle only to be thrown back by its magic. The oath was testing her, searching for any hint of deception, any crack in her certainty. But there was no deception. She'd broken the curse by surviving, by bearing witness to Draven's grief and refusing to let it destroy her. No one had tampered with the magic. No one had weakened the curse. She'd simply been strong enough. The chains released her all at once, and Elara fell to her knees, gasping. The circle's light died, and suddenly Draven was there, pulling her into his arms and holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. You're alive, he choked out. You're alive. I told you. Elara managed, her voice shaky but triumphant. I told you it would be fine. She looked up to see Kristoff's expression had gone carefully blank. The oath accepted her testimony, he said, and for the first time he sounded uncertain. Which means the curse broke naturally, without interference. Which means you're leaving, Draven said without looking away from Elara. Now, and you're never returning to my territories. Casimir, see him out. Kristoff was escorted from the throne room, his trap dismantled and his petition void. The moment he was gone, Draven swept Elara into his arms and carried her from the court, ignoring everyone who tried to speak to him. He didn't stop until they were in his private chambers with the door firmly locked. Never again, he said, setting her carefully on the bed. You're never taking that kind of risk again. I had to. I don't care. Draven's hands framed her face, his eyes wild. I don't care about politics or magical law or anything else. Watching you in that circle, feeling the oath's magic testing you, knowing I was helpless to protect you. He stopped, his voice breaking. It was worse than any torture I've endured in 1,000 years. Elara's heart twisted at the raw vulnerability in his expression. I'm sorry, she said softly. I'm sorry I scared you. But I couldn't let that witch entangle us in magical politics. I knew I was telling the truth, knew the oath wouldn't hurt me. You couldn't know that for certain. Magic doesn't always behave logically. Draven pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. I love you. The thought of losing you terrifies me more than I can express. I love you too, Elara whispered, and felt him go still. I've been falling in love with you since the moment I started reading your diary. Every loss, every grief, every moment of compassion you showed, even when the world gave you every reason to become bitter, it all made me love you more. So yes, I love you. Completely and probably unwisely, but I do. Draven kissed her then, fierce and claiming, and Elara kissed him back with equal intensity. They fell into bed together, and this time the desperation in their lovemaking came from the knowledge of how close they'd come to permanent separation. Afterward they lay tangled together, and Draven's fingers traced idle patterns on Elara's bare shoulder. Marry me, he said quietly. Elara's breath caught. What, marry me? By human law, vampire custom, whatever ceremony you prefer, I want you bound to me in every way possible. Draven propped himself up on one elbow, looking down at her with absolute certainty. I know we haven't been together long by human standards. I know there are complications we haven't fully resolved. But I don't care. I want to spend whatever time we have as your husband. Elara's mind raced. It was crazy they'd known each other for less than a month. But at the same time she'd seen into his soul through the diary. She knew him in ways most people never knew their partners even after decades. And she loved him with an intensity that should have been frightening but instead felt inevitable. Yes, she said. Yes, I'll marry you. Joy transformed Draven's features, making him look younger, less burdened. He kissed her deeply, reverently, and when they finally broke apart, his eyes were bright. I'll give you everything, he promised, every night for the rest of your life. I'll make sure you never regret choosing me. The wedding was arranged within a week. Vampire efficiency, combined with Draven's authority, meant nothing could slow the preparations. Elara stood in a private chamber wearing a gown of deep midnight blue silk, her hands shaking as Serafina helped arrange her hair. Nervous? The vampire asked with a knowing smile. Terrified, Elara admitted. Not about marrying Draven, I'm completely certain about that, but about everything else. I'm human, he's vampire. We have maybe 50 years together if I'm lucky, and even that's assuming nothing kills me before old age does. Serafina's expression softened. Do you know why Draven never married Elena, the violinist he loved? Elara shook her head. Because she refused him. Said that marriage would make her death harder to bear, would give him false hope that she might change her mind about immortality. Serafina adjusted a final pin in Elara's hair. The fact that he's asked you to marry him means he's made peace with your mortality. He's choosing to love you fully despite knowing he'll lose you. And that's extraordinary. What if I'm not strong enough for that? Elara whispered. What if I reach the end of my life and I'm too scared to let go? What if I beg him to turn me even though I know it's not what I really want? Then he'll honor whatever choice you make in that moment, Serafina said simply. Draven won't force immortality on you, but he won't withhold it if you truly ask for it. He'll give you exactly what you need, whatever that turns out to be. The wedding ceremony was conducted in the palace's great hall, witnessed by the entire vampire court and a handful of trusted humans who served as Elara's witnesses. Draven wore black velvet and silver, looking every inch the immortal king, but his eyes were soft as Elara walked toward him. They exchanged vows written by both of them, Draven promising to cherish and protect Elara for every moment of her life, Elara promising to love and stand beside Draven without fear of what the future held. When they kissed to seal the bond, the court erupted in polite applause, but Elara barely heard it. Her entire world had narrowed to the vampire king holding her like she was the most precious thing in existence. The celebration afterward was elaborate. Vampires knew how to throw a party, apparently, but Draven stole Elara away before it ended, pulling her to their private chambers with unconcealed impatience. I've waited long enough to have you as my wife, he said, his voice rough with want. The court can celebrate without us. What followed was a wedding night that Elara knew she'd remember for the rest of her life. Draven worshipped her with his hands and mouth, whispered promises against her skin in languages she didn't speak but understood anyway through pure emotion. When they finally came together, it felt like a completion, two souls joining across the impossible divide between mortal and immortal. Afterward, lying in the dark with Draven's cool body against hers, Elara felt utterly content. I never thought I'd end up here, she murmured, married to a vampire king, living in an underground palace, part of a world I didn't even know existed a month ago. Regrets? Draven asked, a hint of vulnerability in his voice. Not even one. Elara shifted to look at him. I know this isn't a normal life. I know there will be challenges and dangers I can't predict. But I'd rather face all of that with you than go back to my safe, ordinary existence. Draven kissed her forehead. I'll spend every night making sure you never have cause to change your mind. The years that followed proved both beautiful and complicated. Elara learned to navigate vampire politics with increasing skill, becoming an advisor to Draven in matters involving the human world. Her insight into modern mortal concerns proved invaluable as the court adapted to changing times. She helped negotiate new arrangements with Philadelphia's human leadership, updated the old agreements for the digital age, and even convinced several younger vampires to adopt less predatory feeding practices. You're civilizing us. Lucien joked one evening when Elara successfully convinced him to try synthetic blood supplements instead of hunting exclusively from humans. I'm keeping you from starting a war with hunter organizations, Elara corrected. There's a difference. Draven, meanwhile, slowly rediscovered parts of himself he'd buried under centuries of grief. With Elara beside him, he began to engage more fully with his court again. He attended cultural events in the city above, sponsored artists and musicians, even laughed, something his inner circle admitted they hadn't heard in decades. You've awakened him, Casimir told Elara after one particularly lively court session. The king we remember from centuries past is finally returning, but the question of Elara's mortality hung between them, unspoken but present. As she moved through her late 20s and into her 30s, the reality that their time was finite became harder to ignore. Draven never mentioned it, but Elara caught him watching her sometimes, with an expression of such profound sadness that it made her heart ache. It was during her 35th year that everything came to a head. Elara was researching in the palace library when she felt a sharp pain in her chest that stole her breath. She gasped, pressing a hand over her heart, and suddenly Draven was there, moving too fast for her eyes to track. What's wrong? He demanded, his hands hovering over her like he didn't know where to touch. I don't know, it just... The pain came again, sharper this time, and Elara's knees buckled. Draven caught her, lifting her effortlessly and carrying her at supernatural speed to the palace's medical wing. The diagnosis came from the court's physician, A vampire who'd been a doctor for 3 centuries. A congenital heart defect. Something Elara had been born with but that had remained undetected until now. It was worsening, and without intervention, she had perhaps 5 years left. Maybe less. Elara took the news with outward calm, but inside she was reeling. She was only 35. She'd thought she had decades left. Time to make peace with her mortality. Time to prepare Draven for her eventual loss. 5 years was nothing. A blink of an eye. Draven's reaction was carefully controlled in front of the doctor, but the moment they were alone his facade cracked. "No," he said simply. "No, I won't accept this." "There's nothing to accept or reject," Elara said, her voice shaking. "It's a medical fact. My heart is failing. Then I'll turn you." Draven's hands gripped her shoulders. "I'll make you vampire tonight, and you'll heal. You'll live." Alara's breath caught. They'd avoided this conversation for years, both knowing it would eventually be necessary, but neither willing to force it prematurely. Now, faced with imminent death, the choice stared her in the face with brutal clarity. "I don't know if I'm ready," she whispered. "You'll die if you don't change," Draven said, and his voice broke. "Please, Elara, I can't survive losing you. Not now. Not when I've finally learned to live again because of you." Tears streamed down Alara's face. "I'm scared. I'm scared of losing my humanity. Of becoming a predator, of living forever while everyone I've ever known dies. I'm scared I'll resent you for turning me. Scared I'll change so much that I won't recognize myself anymore." Draven pulled her close and she felt him shaking. "I'm scared too. Scared you'll hate me for making you vampire. Scared immortality will eventually steal the things I love most about you. But I'm more scared of a world without you in it." He tilted her face up to his. "So I'm begging you, as your husband, as the man who loves you more than his own existence, please let me save you." Elara closed her eyes, thinking through the implications. If she became vampire, she'd lose the sun, lose the ability to age naturally, lose her human warmth and heartbeat. But she'd gain centuries with Draven, time to continue the work they'd started together, time to truly be his partner in every sense. And the alternative was leaving him, abandoning him to more grief after he'd only just learned to heal from the last losses. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay, do it, turn me." Relief and terror warred across Draven's features. "You're certain?" "No," Elara admitted. "But I'm more certain about spending eternity with you than I am about leaving you to grieve alone. So yes, turn me." The transformation was arranged for the following night, giving Elara time to say goodbye to her humanity. She spent the day above ground, walking through Philadelphia in sunlight one last time, eating her favorite foods, calling the few human friends she'd maintained contact with. Each moment felt both precious and elegiac, a farewell to the life she'd known. When night fell, she returned to the palace and found Draven waiting in their chambers. He looked haunted, and Elara understood. This was the moment that would either save them both or destroy everything they'd built together. "Last chance to change your mind," Draven said quietly. Elara shook her head. "I'm ready. Show me how to become what you are." The turning was agony. Draven's bite was gentle, but the venom that followed was liquid fire in her veins. Elara screamed as her body began to die and transform, as her heart slowed and her human warmth drained away. Draven held her through all of it, whispering reassurances in languages both ancient and modern, his voice the only anchor keeping her tethered to sanity. When she woke 3 days later, everything was different. Her senses were sharper, her strength immense, and the constant background noise of her failing heart was simply gone. She sat up slowly and found Draven beside her, his expression anxious. "How do you feel?" he asked. Elara took inventory. Her body felt powerful, coiled with predatory grace. The room's shadows no longer hid secrets. She could see perfectly in the darkness. She could hear conversations happening floors away, could smell blood and fear and magic distinct as different perfumes. "Strange," she said, and her voice sounded different. Clearer somehow, like I've been wearing earplugs and blinders my whole life and suddenly they're gone. Draven's hand found hers, and she realized his touch no longer felt cold. They were the same temperature now, both dwelling in the space between living and dead. "Do you hate me?" he asked quietly. "For making you this?" Elara considered the question honestly. Did she regret losing her humanity? Yes, in some ways. The sun, the simple pleasures of mortal life, she'd miss those. But when she looked at Draven, at the man who'd survived impossible losses and learned to love again because of her, she couldn't regret choosing to stay with him. "No," she said. "I don't hate you. I'm grieving what I lost, but I'm also grateful for what I've gained. We have time now, centuries to be together, to continue building something beautiful. That's worth the cost." Relief transformed Draven's features. "I'll help you through the transition, teach you to control the bloodlust, show you how to navigate vampire society as one of us instead of a protected human. You won't have to face any of this alone." The adjustment was difficult. Elara had to learn to hunt, a skill that made her stomach turn at first, though Draven taught her to feed carefully, taking only what she needed without killing. She had to adapt to vampire politics from a new perspective, navigating challenges to her position as Draven's consort now that she was his equal in immortality rather than his protected mortal. But she also discovered unexpected joys. Art and music took on new dimensions with her heightened senses. She could read ancient text in languages that now made intuitive sense. She could fight alongside Draven when threats arose, no longer a liability to be protected but a partner in truth. 5 years after her turning, as they stood together on the palace's highest balcony looking out over nighttime Philadelphia, Elara finally felt settled in her new existence. "I've been thinking," she said, leaning into Draven's side, "about your diary. About how reading it connected us in the first place." "What about it?" Draven asked, his arm coming around her waist. "I want to start writing my own. A record of my transformation, of learning to be vampire, of everything we've built together." Elara looked up at him. "So that centuries from now, if you ever start to forget what this time was like, you'll have something to help you remember." Draven's expression softened. "And if you're the one who forgets, then you'll read it to me," Elara said simply. "We'll bear witness to each other's memories, help each other carry the weight of immortality. Together, Draven agreed and kissed her beneath the stars they could now both see with perfect clarity. Decades passed, then a century. Elara grew into her power, became a respected figure in vampire society in her own right. She and Draven ruled the Philadelphia court jointly, modernizing old traditions while preserving the core codes of honor that had kept their kind civilized for millennia. They faced challenges: political intrigue, territorial disputes with other vampire courts, the occasional hunter who needed to be dealt with, but they faced them together. Sometimes on quiet nights when the court was settled and the city above them slept, they'd return to the library where Elara had first read Draven's cursed diary. She'd pull out her own journal now, filled with over a century of entries, and read passages aloud. Draven would listen, his expression peaceful, and sometimes add his own memories of the events she described. "Do you regret it?" he asked one such night. "Becoming vampire? Giving up your mortal life?" Elara considered the question. She'd lost the sun, lost the ability to grow old naturally, lost the simple human connections that had once defined her existence. But she'd gained something infinitely more valuable, a love that spanned centuries, a partnership that had weathered every challenge, and the knowledge that she'd never have to face eternity alone. "No," she said firmly. "I'd make the same choice again, every time." Draven pulled her close, and they sat together in comfortable silence. Outside, the world continued its endless turning, seasons changing, civilizations rising and falling. But in that moment, surrounded by books and memories and the certainty of each other's presence, they were simply two immortals who'd found something worth surviving for. Elara had wept at every loss Draven had survived when she'd first read his diary aloud. Now, centuries later, she understood that survival was never about avoiding grief or hardship. It was about finding reasons to continue despite the losses, about building new joys even when the old ones had faded. Together, they'd built something that would outlast empires, a love that had survived curses, mortality, and the brutal weight of immortal existence itself. And that, Elara thought as Draven kissed her forehead with infinite gentleness, was the only happy ending that mattered. Not the absence of struggle, but the presence of someone who'd face every struggle beside you without hesitation or regret. They had centuries ahead of them still, countless nights to fill with love and laughter, and the occasional necessary violence that came with being vampire royalty. But they'd face it all together, bound by choice and love and the shared understanding of what it meant to survive not just existence but the grief that came with truly living. The diary sat on a nearby shelf, its curse broken, its pages no longer weapons of torment but simply records of a life fully lived. Beside it rested Elara's journal, still being written, still accumulating memories that would outlast mountains. Two immortals, two diaries, one love story that had conquered grief itself. That was their truth, their triumph, their forever. And in the end, that was everything.